The sun hangs high in the clear blue sky, casting a warm glow over a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Birds chirp softly, their songs filling the quiet morning air as a gentle breeze sways the trees. The camera pans across the picturesque homes, each with manicured lawns and white picket fences, everything seemingly perfect. We zoom in on one particular house, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. In the backyard, a young girl sits in a wheelchair, her face lighting up with a soft smile as she watches a butterfly flutter past. This is Emily, a girl whose life has always been defined by challenges, but who has learned to find joy in the little things. Surrounded by the warmth of her family's home, she feels safe, protected by the invisible barrier that her parents have worked tirelessly to build for her. Her mother, Megan, hovers nearby, ensuring Emily's comfort as she adjusts the blanket on her lap. She brushes a lock of hair from Emily's face with a tender hand, her eyes filled with love and concern. Despite the challenges Emily faces, her spirit remains unbroken. She laughs softly at something her mother says, her smile wide and genuine. But beyond the tranquil scene, a dark presence begins to stir. Karen, the notorious HOA board member, is watching from the sidewalk, her sharp eyes scanning the house with a calculating gaze. Her sleek, silver car is parked across the street, a subtle yet ominous reminder that she's always lurking in the background, waiting for the smallest infraction to pounce on. The tension in the air thickens as the camera lingers on her, capturing her cold stare. Karen has made a name for herself in the neighborhood, known for enforcing the HOA's petty rules with an iron fist. Her reputation precedes her, relentless, unforgiving, and ready to take action at any sign of defiance. The serenity of the scene is shattered as Karen's figure approaches the front gate, her steps deliberate and filled with entitlement. Megan notices her from the corner of her eye, her smile faltering as she instinctively stands between Emily and the approaching threat. The once peaceful neighborhood now feels suffocating, as though the calm before the storm is about to break. The music shifts, growing tense and ominous as the camera closes in on Karen's face. This moment, so filled with innocence and love, is about to be marred by something unthinkable. Emily had never known a life without challenges, born with a rare condition that left her unable to walk. Her world was confined to a wheelchair, a place where the world seemed both distant and unreachable. But despite her limitations, Emily found beauty in the simplest of things. She loved the feeling of the sun on her face, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, and the warmth of her mother's hand as it brushed against her skin. Megan, her mother, had devoted her entire life to ensuring that Emily never felt less than. Every day was a battle for Emily's independence, her happiness, and her dignity. Megan had fought for the right accommodations, for accessible spaces, and for the kindness of others. It was a daily struggle, but one she fought willingly, armed with love for her daughter. Megan's life hadn't always been so difficult. Before Emily's birth, she had been a rising star in the corporate world, an ambitious woman with dreams of making her mark. But the moment she laid eyes on her newborn daughter, everything changed. The world she once knew no longer made sense. Her focus shifted entirely to Emily, to her care, to giving her a life as full as possible. Megan's marriage to David, Emily's father, had also undergone a transformation. David had been supportive, but the strain of caring for a child with special needs tested their bond. There were days when Megan felt completely alone, weighed down by the isolation of Emily's condition and the pressures of keeping her family together. But through it all, David stood by her, and Emily's smile was enough to make it all worthwhile. Yet, despite their unwavering commitment to Emily's care, their life was constantly under threat by forces beyond their control. One of those forces was the HOA, a seemingly benign organization whose sole purpose was to enforce community rules. However, for Megan and David, it had become the embodiment of everything they despised about the world outside their home: cold, bureaucratic, and at times cruel. And at the forefront of the HOA's oppressive rules stood Karen. Karen had always been a fixture in the neighborhood, Once a mild-mannered librarian, she had ascended to power within the HOA, relishing her newfound authority. But it was clear that Karen's motivations went beyond just enforcing rules. She reveled in the control she wielded over her neighbors, and it wasn't long before her obsession with order turned into a quest for domination. She often issued complaints about the smallest infractions: the placement of a garden gnome, the color of a mailbox, or even the positioning of a wheelchair ramp. To Karen, it didn't matter if it made sense. All that mattered was that everyone followed the rules. The conflict between Megan's family and the HOA had been building for years. The first incident occurred when Megan planted a small flower garden in the front yard, an attempt to bring some color into the drab suburban landscape. The HOA had sent her a notice, accusing her of violating the aesthetic rules. The battle had continued, each small confrontation growing more heated, more personal. But when Megan and David decided to build a small, accessible ramp in their backyard so Emily could enjoy the outdoors more freely, Karen took it as a direct affront to her authority. Despite the fact that the ramp was built to allow Emily the independence she deserved, Karen saw it as an eyesore, a challenge to her perfect vision of the neighborhood. Karen's vendetta against the family escalated, with constant complaints, threats, and even an attempt to have the city's inspectors declare the ramp unsafe. Each time, Megan fought back, armed with her knowledge of the law, her determination to protect her daughter, and the support of a few sympathetic neighbors. But every victory felt temporary, as if Karen's hatred was an unending storm. But this time it was different. This time, Karen wasn't just angry about a garden or a ramp. This time, Karen had crossed a line that could never be undone. She had seen Emily in the backyard, vulnerable, and she had made her decision. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control. Karen wanted to make a statement, and in her eyes, Emily's life didn't matter. Only her authority did. As Megan prepared for another confrontation with Karen, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was on the horizon. But nothing could have prepared her for the horror that would unfold just hours later. The air felt thick with tension as the days passed. Megan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her stomach that something was coming, a storm that neither she nor David could control. Every time she glanced out the window, she saw Karen lurking on the sidewalk, her eyes cold and calculating as she watched the family. The friendly suburban neighborhood that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed suffocating, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The quiet that had once comforted Megan now made her uneasy. It felt like the calm before a disaster. Emily, unaware of the escalating hostility, continued to enjoy her time in the backyard. The gentle laughter of her mother and the soft hum of the neighborhood were her world, untouched by the cruelty that simmered just beyond the gate. But Megan noticed the way the neighbors now avoided eye contact, their greetings curt and awkward, as if they were choosing sides without saying a word. And the HOA meetings had grown more frequent, the emails more venomous, all focused on scrutinizing every aspect of the family's home, every decision they made. One afternoon, as the family sat together in the living room, the doorbell rang. Megan's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She glanced at David, who was sitting next to her on the couch, his face just as tense as hers. With a quiet sigh, Megan stood and made her way to the door. As she opened it, she was met with Karen's steely gaze. Her mouth was set in a hard line, and her eyes held a coldness that sent a shiver down Megan's spine. "You're not welcome here, Karen," Megan said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. She had said it before, but this time it felt different, heavier, more final. Karen ignored the dismissal and stepped forward, holding a letter in her hand. "I'm here to inform you that if you don't comply with the HOA's demands to remove that ramp and restore the property to its original state, I'll be forced to escalate this," Karen said, her tone cold and calculating. "You've been warned, Megan. This is your final notice." Megan's blood boiled. She had fought for months to make the necessary modifications for Emily's accessibility, and now Karen was threatening to take it all away. But this wasn't just about a ramp anymore. Megan could see the gleam in Karen's eyes, a deep-seated hatred that ran far deeper than property rules. This was personal. It always had been. Karen, you've gone too far this time, Megan replied, her voice steady but laced with the anger she could no longer hide. My daughter has every right to live with dignity. You will not take that away from her. Not now, not ever. Karen smirked, her lips curling into a thin, mocking smile. We'll see about that. You'll regret not listening. With that, Karen turned on her heel and marched back toward the sidewalk, her steps purposeful and filled with malice. Megan stood there, feeling the weight of the threat hang in the air. As Karen disappeared from view, Megan closed the door and leaned against it, her hands trembling. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the tension building in her body. This is getting out of hand, David muttered, his voice low, almost fearful. We need to find a way to put an end to this. I'm not sure how much more we can take. Megan nodded, her mind racing. She was exhausted, emotionally drained from the constant battle, but she knew there was no turning back now. She wouldn't allow Karen to bully them into submission. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. In fact, she felt as though they were standing on the edge of something terrible, something they weren't ready for. Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Megan and David sat in silence, their thoughts heavy. The house felt quieter than usual, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic, the only noise breaking the silence. As Megan sipped her tea, her gaze fell on the window, and she saw Karen again, this time standing in the shadows, watching them from across the street. Megan's heart skipped a beat. There was something about Karen's presence that felt different tonight, something darker. Why won't she just leave us alone? Megan whispered, frustration and fear tinging her voice. David didn't respond immediately. He was lost in thought, his brow furrowed as he stared at the empty space in front of him. I don't know, but I don't think this is about the ramp anymore. Karen's not just fighting us over the property. She's obsessed with control. She won't stop until she's broken us. Megan took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in her chest. We'll fight back. We have to. But deep down, Megan knew that no matter how much they fought, Karen's obsession would only escalate. And the worst part was that Emily, the most vulnerable of them all, was completely unaware of the danger that loomed over their home. As Emily slept peacefully upstairs, the storm was quietly gathering strength, ready to strike when they least expected it. The tension reached its breaking point the next day when Megan received an unexpected letter in the mail. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was a warning from the police. They had been alerted to an alleged violation of city codes and were threatening legal action if the ramp wasn't removed immediately. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Megan read the words, her stomach twisting into knots. It was official. Karen had found a way to make this fight even more personal, and the consequences of this battle were about to become far worse than they could have imagined. The day dawned cold and gray, as if the weather itself knew that something unspeakable was about to happen. Megan awoke to the muffled sound of Emily's soft breathing from the room next door, a sound that usually brought comfort. But today it felt like a warning. The tension of the past few days had seeped into every corner of their home, filling it with a quiet unease that neither Megan nor David could shake off. The clock ticked forward, the hours slipping away like sand through fingers, each moment adding to the mounting anxiety. Megan stood in the kitchen, trying to shake off the sense of impending doom. She stirred the coffee absent-mindedly, watching the steam rise from her cup, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the past week. Karen had crossed a line, escalating the fight from petty complaints about a ramp to threatening legal action. Megan knew the HOA had far too much power, but she couldn't let Karen win. She wouldn't, not when Emily had already fought so hard for every bit of independence she had. The day dragged on. Emily had spent the morning playing in the living room, her laughter filling the house as she played with her favorite stuffed animals. Megan sat beside her, watching her daughter's innocence, her heart aching. Emily had no idea what was coming. Megan didn't want to believe that anything could happen, but the gnawing feeling in her gut grew stronger. It was shortly after lunch when the calm of the afternoon shattered. The front door swung open with a force that made Megan jump. She rushed toward the entryway, her heart pounding in her chest, but by the time she reached the door, she was too late. Karen was already standing on the porch, holding something in her hand. A gun. Megan froze, her blood running cold as the sight of the weapon registered in her mind. The door, which had been a symbol of protection, now seemed like a fragile barrier between her family and unspeakable danger. Karen stood there, her cold eyes locked onto Megan's, a twisted smile curling at the corners of her lips. "You don't listen, Megan," Karen said, her voice low and steady. "You never listen. But now you'll understand. You'll learn what happens when you defy me." Megan's heart raced as she instinctively took a step back, pulling Emily closer to her. The gun in Karen's hand felt like it was the only thing in the room, its presence overwhelming everything else. "Karen, please," Megan said, her voice trembling as she tried to reason with the woman standing in front of her. "This isn't the answer. You can't do this." But Karen's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden, swift motion, she raised the gun and aimed it at Emily, who was now too far from her mother's protective embrace to be safe. Megan's breath caught in her throat. "No, Karen, don't." Before she could finish her plea, the gunshot rang out, the deafening sound echoing through the quiet house. Time seemed to stop. Megan's vision blurred with tears as she watched Emily, her precious daughter, collapse in her wheelchair, the blood pooling around her like a horrifying scarlet halo. Megan screamed, rushing to her daughter's side, her heart breaking as she saw the blood seeping from Emily's side. She fell to her knees, hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Emily, baby, please," she cried out, her voice raw and desperate. But Emily couldn't move. She was paralyzed, unable to do anything but gasp for air. Megan's hands were covered in her daughter's blood as she struggled to apply pressure to the wound, but it was like holding back the tide. She could feel Emily's life slipping away with every breath. David appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock. The gunshot had brought him running, but now he stood frozen, his body shaking with disbelief. "Megan," he whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at their daughter, lying there in a pool of blood. His world seemed to collapse around him, and he dropped to his knees beside Megan, trying to help her stop the bleeding. But Karen wasn't finished. She stood there, a satisfied look on her face, as she watched the scene unfold before her. She had done what she came to do. The damage was done, and it felt as though nothing could undo it. Megan couldn't tear her eyes away from Emily's face, the look of confusion and pain in her eyes. She knew her daughter didn't understand what had just happened, but Megan did. She understood all too well. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a calculated attack, a statement, a punishment. And it wasn't over yet. David grabbed the phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he tried to give them the information. But Karen wasn't finished with her game. As David turned to make the call, Karen stepped forward, her gun still aimed at the family, her voice filled with venom. "You think you can stop me?" Karen sneered. "You think you can fight back against me? You're nothing. And now, you'll pay the price for defying me." The phone call, the sirens, the chaos, it all blurred together as the world around Megan and David spun out of control. Every instinct told her to protect Emily, to save her, to do whatever it took to make this nightmare end. But as Karen's cruel words echoed in the air, Megan realized that the fight wasn't just for their daughter's survival, it was for their very lives. In that moment, as the seconds stretched into an eternity, Megan made a promise to herself and to her daughter. This woman would pay for what she had done. There would be justice, and no matter what happened next, Karen would never win again. The world had slowed to a painful crawl as the sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Megan's heart thudded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the horror that had just unfolded in front of her. She knelt beside Emily, her hands still pressed against the wound, but it felt like nothing could stop the bleeding. Emily's eyes fluttered, the flicker of life still lingering, But her breathing was shallow, labored. Every moment felt like an eternity, every second a cruel countdown to a future that seemed more uncertain with each passing breath. David was still on the phone with 911, his voice trembling as he gave them the address, his words barely audible over the sound of his own panic. Please, please hurry, he begged, the fear in his voice evident. He turned to look at Karen, who stood motionless, the gun still hanging loosely in her hand. She didn't seem concerned about the arrival of the authorities. She didn't seem concerned about anything, her cold expression betraying no emotion, no remorse. Karen, you've done enough, David said, his voice low and shaking with rage and disbelief. You've hurt my daughter. You've hurt my family. What do you want from us? But Karen didn't answer. She only stared, her gaze unwavering, as if she was a spectator in her own twisted game. Megan wanted to scream at her, to demand justice right then and there, but her priority was Emily. She had to focus on her daughter. Megan gently cradled Emily's head in her hands, brushing her damp hair from her forehead as she whispered, "Stay with me. Baby, please stay with me." In the distance, the sound of tires screeching and the rush of emergency vehicles grew louder, but it felt like they would never arrive. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like 1,000, as Megan's mind raced with 100 thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. What if Emily didn't survive this? What if they couldn't save her? The thought was unbearable. Yet it lingered in the back of her mind, a fear she couldn't push away. David finally hung up the phone, his eyes still locked on Karen, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. "You're going to pay for this," he said quietly, but his words were filled with a fierce conviction. "You'll never get away with it." Karen's lips curled into a sickening smile, her eyes glinting with some dark satisfaction. "I've already won," she said coldly. "You're nothing but weak, pathetic fools. This whole neighborhood is mine. Everything you've tried to do, it's all for nothing." Megan couldn't understand it. How could someone, anyone, be so cruel? How could Karen be so heartless? She had watched her daughter, her little girl, suffer in a way that no parent should ever have to witness. Megan had fought so hard to protect her, to give her a life filled with love and safety. And now this? She couldn't process it. The anger inside her burned so hot, it felt like it might consume her whole. As the first police cars arrived, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the scene, Megan finally pulled her attention away from Karen, focusing on the paramedics who rushed her side. One of them knelt beside Emily, carefully assessing her injuries. Megan watched as they worked quickly, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. She barely registered the officers who stepped past her, their attention fixed on Karen, who still stood there with the gun hanging limply in her hand. The paramedic spoke softly to Megan, his words almost drowned out by the sounds of the chaos around them. "Ma'am, we need to get her to the hospital. She's losing a lot of blood. We're going to do everything we can." Megan nodded, her heart in her throat. "Please, please save her," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She didn't care about the questions the police would ask or the accusations that would come against Karen. All she cared about was Emily. All she cared about was making sure her daughter survived this nightmare. As they loaded Emily into the ambulance, Megan climbed in beside her, refusing to leave her daughter's side for even a second. David followed close behind, but Megan's world had narrowed to just Emily, just the sound of her breathing, the steady rise and fall of her chest, and the feeling of her hand in hers. She squeezed it gently, a silent promise that she would fight for her. The ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every minute was a lifetime. Megan's mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears. She couldn't lose Emily. Not like this. Not to someone like Karen. She had to survive. Megan had to believe that. She had to hold onto the hope that there was still a chance. Meanwhile, back at the house, the police were finally taking action. Karen had been handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, but she remained eerily calm, as though none of this had any real consequence for her. She wasn't panicked, wasn't begging for mercy. She just stared ahead, detached, almost as if she was in a trance. The officers were interviewing witnesses, neighbors who had heard the gunshot and seen the aftermath. But Megan didn't care about any of that right now. All that mattered was Emily. When they arrived at the hospital, Megan was nearly hysterical, her eyes filled with tears as she begged the doctors and nurses to save her daughter. The medical team immediately took over, rushing Emily into the emergency room, but Megan wasn't allowed to follow. She stood frozen in the hallway, her hands trembling as she gripped the railing, her mind replaying the horrible moments of the attack. She couldn't shake the image of Emily's blood pooling on the ground, her helplessness etched in her memory. David stood beside her, his presence offering little comfort. He too was lost in his thoughts, his face pale and haunted. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and shared fear. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Their lives had been shattered in an instant, and nothing would ever be able to put the pieces back together. Not until justice was served. Hours passed like days, and Megan couldn't help but think of Karen, of the woman who had ruined their lives, who had destroyed everything they held dear. The anger that had been simmering inside her all afternoon now boiled over, threatening to consume her entirely. She couldn't let Karen get away with this. She couldn't let anyone hurt her family like this. There would be no forgiveness. There would be no mercy. Only justice. And Megan vowed, with every fiber of her being, that she would make sure Karen paid. The waiting room was silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights above and the distant murmur of voices through the hallway. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second stretching longer than the last. Megan sat there, her hands folded in her lap, eyes red and swollen from hours of silent crying. She couldn't even remember how long it had been since Emily was rushed into the emergency room. The only thing that was clear in her mind was the fear that continued to clutch at her heart. David stood beside her, a shadow of the man he used to be. The anger and fear in his eyes were replaced with a hollow emptiness, like he had already given up on everything. There was no fighting left in him, not until they knew if Emily would survive. The door to the waiting room opened, and a nurse stepped inside. She was young, with a soft expression that seemed to hold a glimmer of hope. Megan shot to her feet, heart pounding as she searched the nurse's face for any hint of good news. The woman's calm demeanor made Megan's stomach drop. "Mrs. Hudson," the nurse asked gently, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Your daughter has stabilized. She's in critical condition, but she's strong. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but she'll need surgery to repair the damage to her internal organs." Megan's breath caught in her throat, a wave of relief washing over her, followed quickly by the crushing weight of what was still to come. Emily was alive, but for how long? And would she ever be the same again? She had survived the initial attack, but it was far from over. The emotional and physical toll would last far longer than the bloodshed of that fateful afternoon. Before Megan could speak, the nurse continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "There's something else you need to know. We found something unusual during the examination, something that didn't make sense at first, but it's very important." Megan's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing as she desperately searched the nurse's face for clarity. "What do you mean? What is it?" The nurse paused, clearly hesitant. "We found traces of poison in your daughter's system, a substance that wasn't present before. It's rare, but we've seen it in cases of deliberate poisoning, chemicals that are usually undetectable in small amounts, but cause severe damage when introduced to the bloodstream." Megan's mind spun, her body going numb at the nurse's words. "Poison? How is that possible? Emily was shot. She was attacked, not poisoned." The nurse exchanged a look with David, who had grown pale, his face twisted in disbelief. "We believe the poisoning may have been done slowly over a period of time before the shooting. It's possible that whoever attacked your daughter didn't just shoot her in a fit of rage. They may have been poisoning her for weeks, even months." Megan's head began to swim, the weight of the revelation crashing down on her. The pieces began to fall into place with horrifying clarity. "Karen. Karen," Megan whispered, the name feeling like a razor blade in her mouth. She's been poisoning Emily all along before the shooting. David's jaw clenched as the realization settled in. His eyes, once clouded with confusion, now burned with fury. But why? Why would she do that? What kind of monster poisons a child? The nurse's gaze softened. I'm afraid we don't have all the answers yet, but we'll do everything we can to help your daughter. Right now, she needs to be stabilized and we'll run more tests to confirm exactly what substances were used. But Mrs. Hudson, you need to prepare yourself. The situation is more complicated than we initially thought. Megan's hands shook as she sat back down, her head spinning with the information she had just learned. She had known Karen was cruel, that she was willing to go to extreme lengths to assert her power, but poisoning Emily, her precious daughter, was a level of malice that Megan couldn't fathom. The woman who had terrorized their family, who had destroyed their peace, had been playing a far darker game than they ever could have imagined. But there was one thing Megan now understood more than ever. Karen hadn't just attacked Emily physically, she had been trying to destroy her from the inside out. The shooting had been the final act in a long, twisted plot, one that had been carefully orchestrated for months. As the nurse left, leaving the family to digest the revelation, Megan's mind raced. The battle was far from over. This was no longer just about surviving the shooting, it was about exposing Karen for the monster she truly was. Megan had always known she had to fight for Emily's life. But now, she understood that this fight was bigger than anything she had ever faced. Karen had taken everything from them, but she wasn't going to get away with it. Not now, not ever. The truth was out, and now they had the ammunition to finally put an end to Karen's reign of terror. But first, they had to keep Emily alive, because the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beep of the heart monitor and the occasional shuffle of nurses moving in and out. Megan sat beside Emily, her hand gently holding her daughter's, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. Emily was still unconscious, her small body pale from the surgery and the brutal trauma she had endured. Yet there was a certain peace in her face now, a contrast to the fear and pain that had once consumed it. She was alive, and for that, Megan could be grateful, even if everything else felt like it was falling apart. David sat across the room, his face drawn and tired, the anger still simmering beneath his calm exterior. They hadn't spoken much since the nurse had dropped the bombshell about the poisoning, both of them too stunned and emotionally exhausted to process what they had learned. But the more they thought about it, the more everything began to make sense. Karen hadn't just been trying to control their family, she had been plotting their destruction from the very beginning. Megan couldn't believe the depth of the woman's cruelty. She had poisoned Emily in the most insidious way, knowing that with each passing day, she was chipping away at her daughter's health. And when that wasn't enough, Karen had escalated it to violence, shooting Emily in an act of cold, calculated revenge. But now, Megan knew what had to be done. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen's twisted reign of terror had to come to an end, and Megan wasn't going to rest until she saw justice done. The first step was to get Emily through this. The doctors were optimistic that, with time and treatment, Emily would recover physically, though the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. But they were hopeful, and Megan would be by her side every step of the way. The second step was to make sure Karen never hurt anyone again. The police had already taken statements from witnesses, from the neighbors who had seen Karen lurking around the house for months, and from the hospital staff who had confirmed the poisoning. But what they didn't have was proof that Karen had been poisoning Emily, proof that she had planned this all along. Megan knew that the police needed more evidence to press charges beyond the shooting. But she wasn't willing to wait around while Karen continued to manipulate the system. This time, they would take matters into their own hands. Megan and David began to work together, tracking down the toxic substances that had been used in the poisoning. They enlisted the help of a private investigator, someone who could dig into Karen's history and uncover any connections or motivations that might lead to her downfall. the investigator uncovered something disturbing. Karen had a history of targeting vulnerable individuals, using her power within the HOA to punish those she felt were beneath her. But this was different. Karen had crossed a line when she decided to attack Emily. There was no going back for now. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Karen had been a part of a much larger scheme, one that involved her using her position to control and destroy the lives of several families in the neighborhood. She had manipulated the system for years, playing the part of a concerned neighbor while secretly orchestrating chaos behind closed doors. But no longer. The media got hold of the story, and soon the entire neighborhood was aware of Karen's twisted actions. The truth came to light, and with it, the public's outrage. People who had once supported Karen began to turn on her, realizing that they had been blind to the monster in their midst. The pressure mounted, and it wasn't long before Karen was arrested, charged with attempted murder, poisoning, and a slew of other crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no escaping the consequences. Megan and David didn't feel victorious. They didn't feel like they had won anything. Their daughter had been wounded in ways that couldn't be undone. The life they had once known was gone, shattered beyond repair. But justice had been served. Karen would never hurt anyone again. The road to recovery for Emily was long. Each day, Megan watched as her daughter struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The emotional scars of the attack were deep, and Megan knew it would take years for Emily to heal fully. But the strength that Emily had shown through it all, the way she fought for her life, gave Megan hope. Hope that, no matter how dark the world seemed, they could still find the light. It wasn't just Emily who had to heal. Megan and David had to rebuild their lives too, piece by piece. The trauma of everything they had endured would never fully fade. But they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The story didn't end with Karen's arrest. It didn't end with the courtroom battles or the headlines in the newspapers. It ended with a mother sitting by her daughter's bedside, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort, telling her that no matter what, she would always be there. Megan had fought for her daughter's life, and in the end, she had won the most important battle of all. The darkness that Karen had brought into their lives would eventually fade, replaced by the warmth of the love that Megan, David, and Emily shared. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was theirs, and that, in the end, was enough. As Megan sat beside Emily's hospital bed, watching her daughter slowly begin to recover, she realized that the battle they had fought was far bigger than any one individual. It was about resilience, about standing up against injustice, and about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Their story, painful as it was, carried a message that needed to be heard, not just for their family, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless or trapped. The fight was never just about defeating one person. It was about the fight for justice, the fight for what's right, and the fight for those who have been harmed, ignored, or oppressed. Megan and David had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not anger, but the unyielding strength to protect your loved ones, to rise above the hate, and to continue fighting even when it seems like the world is against you. As the weeks passed and Emily's health improved, Megan knew their journey wasn't over. They had survived the worst, but there would always be battles ahead, whether in the courtroom or in their own hearts. But together they were stronger. Together they could face anything. And no matter what happened next, they would stand united, their love for each other a force that no one could ever break. Megan leaned over, kissing Emily's forehead, her voice soft but firm. "We made it, baby, and no one can ever take this away from us." Their story was one of survival, of hope, and of the unwavering strength of a family determined to protect what mattered most. If you or someone you know has ever experienced a situation like this or is facing an unjust struggle, don't stay silent. Stand up for what's right. Seek help, expose the truth, and fight for the justice that you deserve. You are never alone.